7th and 8th grade. We're continuing on with America, Land I Love. We're on Chapter 22, Troubled Times for America, and we are just starting with number 9, talking about the presidential election of 1964. So go ahead and turn to your right page, number 9. I sent out a message to yesterday about your due dates. I want you to continue to work on your homework as it comes up, little bit by little bit, so that you're never stuck with a whole bunch of homework all at one time. That's never my intention for you to do that. You're supposed to be doing a little bit at a time. But please don't turn in any new homework. Anything that I already had on the list as due for April 6th, that you can turn in, but anything else, any new stuff, please don't turn that in just yet. I'm working on getting a different kind of grading program out to you. So we're going to start today with chapter 22 and note 9. Here we go. So in the presidential election of 1964, you have Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who became president because of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, running against an Arizona senator named Barry M. Goldwater. The two of them are going to have the major issue of their presidential campaign is going to be the civil rights bills and acts. Civil rights was a huge issue in the 1960s, as it was during the 1860s and the 1880s. Civil rights has been an ongoing issue in American politics and in American civil life and morality. In the 1964 presidential election, we're going to start seeing a very dynamic shift among the politicians of the day, not so much among the people of the United States, but among the politicians. So let's go back just a little bit. During JFK's tenure in office, he was meeting with a civil rights activist named Martin Luther King Jr. and trying to work out civil rights issues that way. It was with MLK's help, and the brother of the president, who was Robert Kennedy, he was also the attorney general at the time, and he's the one who figured out a way to stop certain racist laws in the South by stating that if there is a federally funded freeway going through the South, that nobody on that freeway is allowed to discriminate against somebody who's on the bus system or on train system or on the freeways, because those are federally owned roads. So the Kennedys really started that whole idea, that whole change towards it's a federal issue that allows for lack of discrimination. Federally, we should get rid of discrimination is their viewpoint. And it goes back even further than that. They based their plan on the idea stated by Eisenhower. During the time of Eisenhower, the Little Rock Nine, remember, they tried to desegregate a school in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were turned away at first by the National Guard of Arkansas. And at that point, the United States president said, I'm sending in federal troops to escort these students to class. He sent in paratroopers to escort these 9 students to class. So there was an opportunity for federal to step in before that, and the Kennedys took that idea and they applied it to travel and interstate travel. And now in the presidential election of 1964, we're going to see Lyndon Baines Johnson promising that he's going to continue the civil rights issues that were at first started by Kennedy. He's going to continue those on. As a result of that, you had a lot of younger people really saying, okay, yeah, it's time for this racist garbage to stop. So you had a lot of people who were happy about what happened with JFK, with his civil rights activism, and who were on the same side as Martin Luther King Jr. saying, okay, then we'll vote for Johnson because of this. this was a dynamic shift because Johnson was part of the Democratic Party, as JFK was. JFK and Johnson, both part of the Democratic Party, which had historically been anti-Black, anti-civil rights. They were pro-slavery. It was the Democratic Party of the South that really caused the Civil War to start in the first place. So this was a dynamic shift in the Democratic Party actually pushing for civil rights. And it was really specifically the top leadership, the president and the vice president at this time. Now, the man who was running for the Republican Party was a man named Barry M. Goldwater. And they asked Martin Luther King Jr. why he was not stumping. That means he isn't electioneering for Goldwater. He's not giving speeches in favor of Goldwater and encouraging people to vote for Goldwater. It would have made sense for him to stump for Goldwater because Goldwater was a Republican and Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican. And so people asked him, why aren't you pushing for Goldwater? And MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., came out and said, well, I know Mr. Goldwater, he is not a racist, but he and I have a very big divide. We have a disagreement on how civil rights should be handled in the United States of America. You see, Martin Luther King Jr. believed that it should be a federal issue, that it should be one overreaching bill or act that says absolutely there should be no discrimination. There should not be issues where people are misjudged or not allowed a house or not allowed to vote, not allowed, basic civil rights based on their color. Mr. Goldwater believed that that should be a state issue and that each state should handle that themselves. Johnson, who was racist in everything he really said and did, he wanted those votes. So he stood behind Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Lyndon Baines Johnson did not have a love relationship, but they did have a practical one. They did have a relationship where they wanted to get that Civil Rights Act passed. Lyndon Baines Johnson, even though he was voted in, he won that election. Here we go. By promising to continue the programs of the late John F. Kennedy, he was able to push many social welfare programs through Congress as well. However, the majority of his party, especially the upper echelons of his party, were very much against him when it came to the Civil Rights Act. In fact, the Congress at the time when the Civil Rights Act of, I believe it was 1964, came onto the ballot, onto the floor of the Congress, the Democratic Party created a filibuster where they did not want the vote to go down at all. They were pushing for people to just leave, and so a vote couldn't be taken and kill the bill that way. They did not want that bill to pass at all because they really were angry at LBJ for even considering passing this bill, even though he had run on that specific legislation in order to get reelected. Now, the ability to push many social welfare programs through Congress, this became the new idea of this party, where it was, okay, well, we'll have civil rights, but then we also need to help people that they consider to be victimized as a result of bigotry. But what those welfare programs ended up doing was victimizing people even more. And that's going to cause problems even into today's world. So social welfare programs. We saw this begin with the New Deal with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where he introduced socialism into the United States with little programs that were designed to stamp out poverty. And it ended up increasing the length of the Great Depression by about 8 years. It was quite a long time. Then there was the New Frontier, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who wanted to provide a little bit more in the social welfare area, but he was also pushing for people to actually participate more in government as well. And then the Great Society, which was by Lyndon Baines Johnson, that was his new social welfare program. And his blueprint, you see the newspaper title there, the headline, LBJ's Blueprint, Billions for Schools, the Aged, Medicare, and War on Poverty. Okay, the Great Society became the largest public welfare program since the New Deal. Okay, so Leonard Read is famous for saying such terms as communism, socialism, Fabianism, which is a type of Christian socialism, welfare state, Nazism, fascism, state interventionism, egalitarianism, the planned economy, the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the New Frontier are simply different labels for much the same thing, which is government control of the community it leads. States and local governments began to accept tax dollars from the federal government for new welfare programs. But when they did that, they began to surrender more and more of their authority, that state authority, to Washington, D.C. This is the very thing that Goldwater had been warning against. Okay, he's like, if you take away the state's abilities to actually have authority in their states, because we have a split government. We have what we call a federal government, which means that some of the power is for the central government and some of it's for the state government. That's what federal means. So it should be equally split. But now you have more and more local governments accepting tax dollars from the central federal government for their new program. And as a result, they have surrendered their authority to Washington, D.C., giving Washington, D.C. much more power than the state and local governments. So part of the major Great Society programs, there's quite a lot of them. He wrote bill after bill after bill and signed them. He didn't write the bills, the Congress did, but he signed them. So let's talk about health and welfare. Medicare was established. It was a comprehensive health insurance program for all elderly people, and it was financed through the Social Security system. And we've talked about that before, the Social Security pot of money, that principle that was supposed to be saved for people to retire on. As new social programs came about, the money started to be taken from that Social Security pot, that principle, and that's why it's going broke today, because they're using what should have been there to create interest. Medicaid was founded same year by federal and state governments to provide health and medical insurance to low-income families. And then the Child Nutrition Act established a school breakfast program and expanded the school lunch program and milk program to improve poor children's nutrition. All of these have a good heart, but not necessarily a great way to carry them out, okay? Medicare as part of Social Security, I can see where that could kind of take, precedent, how that could fit together. But when it comes to Medicaid and Child Nutritional Act, that really doesn't have anything to do with Social Security. Social Security is a program that people have paid into with their paychecks. Children aren't paying into that. Okay, when it comes to education, you had the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It targeted aid to students and funded related activities such as adult education and education counseling. The Higher Education Act supported college tuition scholarships, student loans, work-study programs for low and middle-income students. And then Project Head Start funded a preschool program for the disadvantaged. All of these great ideas, but not necessarily the best way to carry it out is by federally funding. State governments funding these things would have probably been a little bit better. Okay, when we talk about the war on poverty, they started the Office of Economic Opportunity. It saw many programs to improve life in inner cities, including the Job Corps, where people were hired to work on government facilities, an education and job training program for at-risk youth. Housing and Urban Development Act established new housing subsidy programs and made federal loans and public housing grants easier to obtain. Demonstration Cities and Metropolitan Development Act helped revitalize urban areas through a variety of social and economic programs. Unfortunately, a lot of these programs were failures. They didn't seem that way at the very beginning, but they very quickly became known as failures. A lot of these acts, they just basically threw up buildings that were very, very basic, but there was no space outside the buildings for people to congregate, for children to play. It put a lot of people in a very small area, and as a result, there was a lot of conflict between families and between different blocks of people. Some of the pop culture references to this war on poverty and these Housing and Urban Development Acts and Demonstration Cities and Metropolitan Development Acts, you can see those in movies like West Side Story. It's basically a retelling of Romeo and Juliet set during this time. Also Good Times, which was a TV show, a sitcom that was out, and it was all about living in these projects. That's what they were called. And even when we've been reading Having Our Say, remember the Delaney sisters. They were there during the time that these big buildings were being created. They had to have their house moved across the street so that one of these buildings could be set up. And they said, you take a bunch of people who've never had anything and you stick them in this building, and then you expect everything to be fine. But you've got people who aren't next to jobs. They don't seem to have any jobs and no way to get jobs. They're just kind of living there, trying to figure out how to make everything work for them. They have to travel very far away to get a job, or they live on unemployment. The children don't really have any place to play. So there were some real issues with this, the Great Society programs. Okay, when we talk about consumer and environmental protection, the Water Quality Act and Clean Air Acts, they supported developments of standards and goals for air quality and water quality. Highway Safety Act supported highway safety by improving federal, state, and local coordination and by creating training standards for emergency medical technicians. And Fair Packaging and Labeling Act required all consumer products to have true and informative labels, which really already should have been in place with the Pure Food and Drug Act. Okay. So for the first time ever, we're going to start seeing school districts accepting money from the government in order to pay for these new programs. But when the local schools did this, they also lost their opportunity to make the decisions for themselves about what they wanted to teach and how they wanted to teach it. So really, for the first time, we see federal government telling local schools how they should teach and what they should teach. Also, since we were talking about lunch ladies here, also what foods they could serve and what not, what foods should be available to students. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited racial discrimination in public places. That is a good thing, but LBJ, working with MLK, who was standing directly behind him, pushed this through. Not one of the Democrats in Congress voted in favor of the Civil Rights Act. It was completely passed by Republicans and for a Democratic president. The Democrats were not happy with LBJ because of this, and so he was under a lot of pressure from his own party as a result of that. The 24th Amendment was passed during this time as well, and it did away with all poll taxes. A poll tax is basically having to pay before you can vote, which is not constitutional anymore. Okay, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 required federal supervision of local elections. This was important because there were too many states who had the right to run their own elections, but were using their rights to take away other people's rights, which is just a crying shame. So now it became a federal supervision of all local elections to make sure that everyone was allowed to vote, and everybody is allowed to vote today. We hear things all the time on the news about, people are trying to keep other people from voting. That's really not an issue. Once you turn 18 and you have registered to vote, you can go to your polling place and you can vote. No one is trying to stop you. No one. It's not happening. The idea that you would have to show your ID, your identification to vote, is really not stopping people from voting. Everybody in the United States pretty much has an ID. If you are an adult, you have either a driver's license or you have a state-issued ID that everybody is allowed to get. You can go to the DMV, even if you don't drive, you can get a state-issued, personal ID. It's not a problem to get an ID. HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, it opened a brand new cabinet position. It was created by LBJ. The man who was in charge of it, Let's see if I have his name. Oh, it's Robert Weaver. HUD poured large amounts of money into inner cities and built these kinds of buildings. It was supposed to improve housing and living conditions, and the people who lived in those houses and those housings will tell you that it was not really a great situation. In fact, our current Secretary of Housing and Urban Development grew up in some of these buildings and said the whole goal of these buildings is to get people out of them. Okay, we want them to improve their lives so they can move out, get out of there as quickly as you can. Robert Weaver was the first Black American cabinet officer, and he was the new head of HUD. And our current head of HUD is a Black American cabinet officer and a former brain surgeon, so he's a very intelligent man. Thurgood Marshall was the first Black Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. When he was a young lawyer, he argued the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education, where Linda Brown was not allowed into school in Kansas, and he fought on the side of her and her family against the Board of Education in Kansas before the Supreme Court. The Fair Housing Act, passed in 1968, prohibited discrimination in renting or selling houses. You cannot say, I don't want to sell to you because of your color or your religion or anything else. If you were going to sell your house, you sell it to the highest bidder. Okay, during the Civil Rights Movement, many Southerners resented federal officials telling their state and local governments what to do. And as a result, you have pictures like this, unfortunately. This sign right here, it says "Go Home, Negro." It's very likely that the man who is wearing the sign, "Give Us American Rights," is maybe not from the South. Maybe he was from the North and marching in the South as a way of protesting. But it doesn't matter where he was from. If he is from the United States, he is home. The Ku Klux Klan took off during the 1920s. Because they presented themselves as a neighborhood watch and neighborhood cleanup committee. When people realized who the Ku Klux Klan really were, a lot of people dropped immediately because their numbers went way up after World War II and then way, way down right afterwards. In the 1920s. The Black Panthers were the other side of that. The Nation of Islam and Black Panthers, they were groups of Black supremacists. So you had white supremacists fighting Black supremacists and both thinking that everybody on the other side was one of these supremacist groups. And that's not true. Most people were far, far in the middle. Okay, Malcolm X was the most prominent Black supremacist leader. He felt that MLK's methods were way too peaceful and slow. At first, he wanted to assert Black power, calling for segregation of the races to preserve Black culture. Later, he did change that idea because he found out that his spiritual leader was not living up to what he said he was living up to. His faith was shaken quite a bit. He, in fact, went back to the roots of his religion, which was Islamic, and went to Mecca, and he went through his Hijra there. And then when he came back to the United States, he said, I think, I still agree that we need to preserve Black culture, but I think we can start working together to do that. And not too long after that, he was gunned down. So in 1965, rival Black Muslim leaders hired gunmen who murdered Malcolm X. As time went by, many people forgot that Malcolm X had supported violence and racial separations. He became a symbol of Black pride. But it's also really important to remember that toward the end of his life, he was stepping away from the idea of violence and racial separation. Of all the Black leaders in the civil rights movement, none has matched the stature of Martin Luther King Jr. in people's minds. He is the one people look to for peaceful resolution of these very difficult problems. King used the ideas of Christ, but also of Gandhi in India to learn how to step up to government in a way that is peaceful. So King insisted on nonviolent demonstrations to end discrimination because it made the people who were being violent people look down on those. They said, what are you doing? These are unarmed human beings who are protesting quietly. They're singing hymns. And so when people were violent against groups who were demonstrating to end discrimination, that looked bad on those who were being violent. He is famous for saying, "Don't let anyone pull you so low as to hate them." He didn't want to be a hater. He wanted to continue this desegregation in love. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by a gunman who used the violent atmosphere of the South to justify his own racism. That man was arrested and put in jail. He'll be there for the rest of his life. I believe he died a couple years ago, actually. You can see this is the top picture is like the last picture of Martin Luther King Jr. And then the bottom picture, he is dead on the sidewalk. He was coming out of a hotel room, getting ready to go to a conference. It was MLK's dream that someday people would be judged by their character rather than the color of their skin. He did a speech called "I Have a Dream," and I would strongly suggest that you look that up on YouTube and watch it for yourself. If we were in the classroom right now, I'd be pulling it up, but you can look at that on your own. What he was teaching is biblical, because in Romans 2:11 it says, "For there is no respect of persons with God." That respect word, we often use that to mean, I have great respect for you, meaning you have honor for somebody. What this verse is talking about is you shouldn't treat one person better than another person for any reason. You should treat everybody with equality. There's no respect of persons with God. That means he treats everybody the same. While JFK was still president, we're going to go into a new section. Your book kind of jumps back and forth over the timeline. So we've talked about the civil rights, and now we're going to be talking about what's going on in South Asia, specifically South Vietnam, and talking about how the United States got involved in that. So we're jumping back over the timeline to when JFK was still president and the United States began sending soldiers to South Vietnam to defend that nation against communist leader of North Vietnam, a man named Ho Chi Minh. The idea that if one Asian country fell to communism, the rest would follow began to be bandied about as the domino theory. And Vietnam was one of the first of those dominoes. And the idea was we didn't want all of Southeast Asia to become communist, so we needed to stop the first domino, Vietnam. The press began to use the terms first world, second world, and third world to describe the people of the world and how they functioned. The first world was seen as highly technologically advanced. They had a very advanced civilization, which means they had full control over their food supply. They had time for sports. They had time for art. They had time for literature, writing and reading it. That created the first world idea. And then, of course, many people in the first world were also trading with the rest of the world. Second world, not as much control over the food supply, not as much time to develop the more artistic areas of life. And then the third world is really just people who are just trying to survive. In 1964, the North Vietnamese Navy allegedly attacked American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, we use that word alleged because it still isn't very clear. There are conflicting viewpoints on what happened. The United States was looking to get out of Vietnam in 1964. The first president to send troops over was Eisenhower. And he didn't send troops, he sent like advisors. And then JFK sent a few troops over to help the South Vietnamese military to get them situated. And then LBJ, he wanted to kind of quickly get a win and get out. And so he needed help. He needed the Congress of the United States to say, we will declare war on North Vietnam. So there is some discrepancy on whether or not the Gulf of Tonkin incident actually happened. And a lot of people think that it didn't, but it was used as an excuse for LBJ to go to Congress and say, look, we've been attacked, now we need to declare war. The reason the witnesses that were there say, okay, here's what happened. We were in our ships and we may or may not have trailed into North Vietnamese territory. They opened fire. Some people said, no, there was no open fire. We never saw anybody. People who were on the boat said this. Others said, yes, and we've got, like streaks on the paint where bullets went through, but there's no bullet holes or anything. So it really looked more, you had people swearing the truth on both sides saying, yes, we were attacked. No, we weren't. And so still to this day, this is an incident that people don't have a clear cut, did this happen or did it not? But we do know that LBJ used that incident to increase our military presence in South Vietnam as much as he possibly could as just the president. The president is not allowed to declare war. He has to go to Congress and they have to declare war, which means they are the ones releasing money for soldiers to be sent over, to be housed, and to be equipped. Since the Congress never declared war, the president's hands were tied with how much could actually be sent over to the military to help them as they fought in Vietnam. Okay, that is our time for today, and we will pick this up again tomorrow. I hope you have a very good night.